Hey guys, tonight we're easing into something light. So grab a blanket, dim the lights, and let's wander down the Nile. Not literally, though if you have a river nearby I won't stop you. But we're going to glide along ancient Egypt, not through its wars or pharaoh drama, but through the question no one ever asked in school. What did they actually do for fun? Because yeah, we know about the pyramids and the mummies and all that death cult PR campaign, but it turns out when you peel back the gold masks and the massive temples, Egyptians were just people. People who got bored, people who wanted to kill time. And since Netflix hadn't dropped yet in 2000 BC, they had to improvise. So tonight we're going to explore the wonderfully mundane side of Egyptian entertainment. Spoiler, it's a mix of board games, beer, questionable parties, and activities that archaeologists insist were rituals, but you and I know were just proto-drinking games. Let's start simple. Board games, because nothing says eternal civilization like sitting around with a wooden box yelling at your cousin for cheating. The Egyptians loved board games. Loved them. The most famous one was called Senet, which sounds fancy, but in practice was basically snakes and ladders meets passive-aggressive family arguments. Senet boards show up in tomb paintings, actual game boards have been found buried with the dead, and pharaohs themselves played. Even King Tut had a couple tucked in with him, as if eternity and the afterlife was going to be very, very boring, which it probably was. The rules of Senet aren't fully known, but the gist is, you move pieces along a grid based on stick throws, kind of like dice, but you know, when dice hadn't been invented yet. The game also doubled as a spiritual metaphor for the soul moving through the afterlife, which means your fun family night could also double as a theology lecture. Imagine playing Candyland, but halfway through, someone reminds you that every square represents your eternal fate. Cozy. They also had another game called Mayhen, which literally means the serpent. The board was a coiled snake carved into stone or painted on wood, with little lion-shaped pieces crawling along the serpent's body. Which honestly sounds cooler than most games we've got now. Picture an ancient family huddled around their glowing oil lamps, pushing tiny lions across a snake spiral and arguing about whether Grandpa was miscounting the moves again. And here's the kicker. Board games weren't just toys, they were status symbols. Wealthier dragons had ornate game boards made of ivory and ebony, while poorer folks carved simple versions in the dirt, which means no matter the social class, everyone at some point muttered, "Hurry up, it's your turn." So if you've ever fallen asleep mid-Monopoly game, congratulations, you're basically channeling the spirit of ancient Egypt. Next up, music and dancing. Now, if you're picturing elegant harp players and solemn temple chants, yeah, that's part of it. But Egyptians also had parties, and they were not subtle about it. 2 art shows dancers in revealing outfits, musicians banging drums, and lots of people clapping along, which suggests at least some evenings in Thebes looked less like a sacred ritual and more like a cousin's wedding reception after too much beer. They had harps, lutes, flutes, drums, and something that looked suspiciously like a tambourine. Women often played the instruments. Professional musicians were a thing. There's even evidence of what we'd call party bands, groups hired to liven up feasts. And yes, this was entertainment for elites, but ordinary people also sang and danced. Music wasn't exclusive, it was woven into daily life. Now here's a fun detail. Egyptians had a favourite percussion instrument called the sistrum. It was basically a rattle on steroids. A metal frame with loose rods that jingled when shaken, used in religious ceremonies. But also, let's be honest, in any situation where you wanted noise. Archaeologists like to describe it in reverent tones, but I like to think of it as the ancient version of someone showing up with a cowbell at a house party. As for the dancing, picture a lot of rhythmic movement, sometimes acrobatic flips, and occasionally routines that, judging by the wall paintings, would have earned them a spot on TikTok's trending page. Except without the ring light. Drinking and feasting. Ah yes, the universal pastime. Egyptians loved beer. Not craft IPA snob beer, but thick, grainy, porridge-like beer that doubled as food. Imagine if oatmeal and Bud Light had a baby. Sounds gross, but they drank it constantly. It was nutritious, filling and mildly alcoholic, perfect for daily hydration when the Nile water wasn't exactly Evian. And when it came to partying, beer was the main fuel, along with wine for the richer folks. Feasts were common: weddings, festivals, religious holidays, or honestly any excuse. Goose, fish, figs, dates, bread, all piled on. And in case you think this was refined and stately, there are tomb inscriptions warning about the dangers of drinking too much, which is archaeologist speak for, yes, people got hammered. There's even a famous hymn to the goddess Hathor that basically encourages worshippers to drink, dance, and forget your troubles. So if you've ever used happy hour as a coping mechanism, congratulations, you're in sync with 3,000 years of tradition. Sports and games. Surprise, Egyptians were sporty, not in the let's invent football way, but more like wrestling, stick fighting, and mock hunting. Boys were trained in physical skills partly for military readiness, but also as recreation. Think roughhousing with extra bruises. They also had swimming races in the Nile, risky given crocodiles, but apparently fun enough that people kept doing it. Some two-march shows young men diving off boats, wrestling in the water, or playing what looks like an ancient version of polo, but with papyrus stalks. Kids had toys too: carved animals, balls made of cloth or leather, and dolls with hair made of string. Which means Egyptian parents also experienced the universal pain of stepping on a toy left on the floor in the middle of the night. Timeless suffering, festivals. Now this is where Egypt really turned up the fun meter. Festivals were basically state-sponsored parties. Cities would hold parades for their gods, dragging giant statues through the streets, while crowds ate, drank, danced, and generally turned the sacred into a block party. One of the biggest was the Festival of Opet in Thebes, celebrating the link between the pharaoh and the god Amun. Picture weeks of music, food and drinking, basically Mardi Gras, but with more hieroglyphs. And then there was the Festival of Drunkenness. Yes, that was its actual name. It honoured Hathor, goddess of love, music and joy. People were expected to drink until they passed out. The logic was spiritual. Hathor once got so angry she almost destroyed humanity, but was calmed by drinking beer dyed red to look like blood. So the festival recreated this drunken peace story. In practice, it meant sanctioned binge drinking. Imagine explaining to your boss that you missed work because it was mandatory blackout day. Pets and hobbies. Not everything was noisy. Egyptians loved their pets. Cats, obviously. They're everywhere in art. But also dogs, monkeys, and even gazelles. Keeping animals was both status and companionship. So yes, somewhere along the Nile, a wealthy merchant was probably chasing his misbehaving pet monkey off the dinner table. Fishing and hunting were also pastimes. But here's the twist. Most commoners fished for food. Wealthy elites. They fished for sport. Tomb paintings show nobles standing in boats, throwing spears at fish in shallow water, which is less about survival and more about showing off how rich you are that you don't need the fish. And finally, storytelling. Because what's civilization without sitting around telling stories? Egyptians had professional storytellers, often attached to temples or courts. Myths, epics, folk tales, these were recited aloud. The tale of Sinuhe, the shipwrecked sailor, or cautionary tales about gods behaving badly. These weren't thrill rides, they were slow, meandering, sometimes moralizing, perfect bedtime content. Honestly, if you read them aloud today, they'd work better than white noise. So what did Egyptians do for fun? The same things we do. They played games, ate too much, drank too much, danced badly and told stories, just with more pyramids in the background. And as we settle into tonight's exploration, remember, history isn't always about battles or pharaohs. Sometimes it's about a group of ancient friends huddled around a board game, rolling sticks, laughing, and probably arguing over who was cheating. Timeless humanity. Hey again, still awake? Or maybe halfway there to dreamland? Either way, let's drift a little deeper into Egypt. We've talked about what ordinary folks did for fun, Games, music, feasts, the occasional crocodile risky swim. But now let's climb a little higher on the social ladder, up into the marble and sandstone halls of Pharaoh's court. Because if peasants had board games and beer, you can bet the royals had, well, board games and beer, but shinier. The first thing to know is this. The court was basically the original exclusive club. Pharaohs were considered divine, children of the gods, walking embodiments of order on earth. So naturally their fun had to look dignified, or at least expensive. Royal banquets. Let's start with food and drink because humans never change. The Pharaoh's court loved banquets. Not the casual let's throw some bread on the table kind, but the kind where you hire 50 servants just to refill wine cups. Banquet halls were decorated with flowers, garlands, and perfumed cones of fat placed on people's heads. Yes, that's real. Cones of scented animal fat or beeswax that slowly melted in the heat, releasing fragrance. Imagine sitting next to your crush with a candle-shaped buttercone slowly dripping down your wig. Romantic. Music was essential. Harps, flutes, lyres, tambourines. Dancers, often young women, performed in the middle of the hall, while nobles reclined on cushions. The pharaoh himself, he'd preside like the guest of honour, sipping imported wine, occasionally tossing a comment that everyone had to laugh at. And if you're wondering, yes, people drank too much. Some tomb inscriptions read like passive-aggressive PSAs about overindulgence. One scribe wrote, "Do not indulge in drinking beer, lest you utter words you'll regret." Which suggests plenty of ancient nobles were slurring bad poetry at 3 a.m. while their servants rolled their eyes. Pets in the palace. Now, Egyptians loved animals in general, but the court took it to another level. Pharaohs kept cats, of course, sleek, pampered, practically mini divinities, but also dogs, exotic birds, baboons, and even lions. Yes, lions, because nothing says I'm a god on earth like casually keeping a predator in your courtyard. Pharaoh Ramses II reportedly had pet lions that followed him into battle, which sounds epic but also impractical, like bringing your emotional support tiger into the office. Monkeys were a court favourite too. They were trained to fetch things, pour drinks and entertain guests, which means that somewhere in the New Kingdom, a monkey probably spilled wine on a general's lap, and the pharaoh found it hilarious. Hobbies of pharaohs. Now, you might think ruling an empire left little time for hobbies, but pharaohs had to project this aura of cultured superiority. So hobbies weren't just hobbies, they were PR. Take hunting. Pharaohs loved to be depicted hunting lions, hippos and gazelles. Tomb walls are filled with heroic images of them pulling back bows or tossing spears. It was symbolic. The king bringing order by conquering wild chaos. In reality, it was probably more like a royal safari with 20 servants corralling the poor hippo so the pharaoh could get a clean shot. Fishing was another pastime. Again, not the practical kind, but ceremonial fishing, where the pharaoh sat in a gilded boat casting lines into the Nile, while attendants pretended this was the most profound thing they'd ever seen. And then there was chariot riding. Imagine a pharaoh casually practicing figure eights in the courtyard with a gleaming team of horses, while scribes jotted notes like, "Truly, he is the embodiment of Ra." Chariots were both military tools and luxury toys. The elite had finely decorated ones, with gold inlays and leather trim, basically the sports cars of their time. Entertainment on demand. The pharaoh's court had access to the best entertainers in the kingdom. Professional musicians, dancers, acrobats, all on call. And these weren't amateur open mic acts. They were trained performers, many tied to temples or noble households. Some entertainment was religious, priests performing ritual dances, sacred hymns chanted in deep tones. But others were secular. Juggling or acrobatics, comic sketches. Yes, ancient Egypt had clowns. They were usually dwarfs or jesters attached to noble households, known for their wit and antics. And while the art makes them look solemn, You can bet they were making sarcastic asides about the vizier's sandals. Imagine being a pharaoh bored on a Tuesday night. You clap your hands and suddenly there's a troupe of dancers, a harpist and a dwarf cracking jokes about crocodiles. Netflix could never compete. The royal garden. Now, here's a surprisingly cosy detail. Pharaohs and nobles loved their gardens. These weren't tiny herb patches. They were sprawling, meticulously planned sanctuaries with pools, shade trees, and exotic plants. Lotus flowers floated on water surfaces, sycamores cast cool shade, and gardeners fussed over date palms. Gardens were multi-purpose, relaxation, status, and ritual. But mainly, they were just beautiful. Imagine the pharaoh strolling through his private garden at sunset, sipping wine, pretending not to notice the army of gardeners sweating to keep everything alive. And the pools, stocked with fish, sometimes even trained ducks, which raises the delightful possibility that elite Egyptian children amuse themselves by chasing ducks around the water, while their tutors tried to look serious. Cosmetic pastimes. Another pastime of the elite was, well, looking good. Cosmetics weren't just practical, they were hobbies. Men and women both used kohl eyeliner, scented oils and elaborate wigs. Hours could be spent perfecting appearance. Servants would grind malachite for eye paint, mix red ochre for lip colour, and apply perfumed oils to keep skin hydrated in the dry climate. Wigs were washed, styled and scented. If you've ever spent a Sunday afternoon experimenting with skincare routines, congratulations, you have pharaoh energy. One papyrus even describes the pharaoh's beauty routine in detail: exfoliation, oils and perfumed ointments. Which means while soldiers were sweating in the desert, their king was probably asking, "Do you think this coal makes my eyes pop?" Leisure as politics now. Here's the interesting part. Pharaoh's fun was never just fun. Everything had a political angle. Banquets showed off wealth. Hunts demonstrated divine strength. Music and dance reinforced the pharaoh's connection to the gods. Even board games symbolized the eternal struggle between order and chaos. In short, no matter what the pharaoh did, scribes would find a way to make it sacred. If he sneezed, it was the blessing of the gods. If he lost at Senate, well, clearly he let his opponent win out of mercy. Convenient. The afterlife angle. And of course, Egyptians believed whatever you enjoyed in life would carry into the afterlife, which is why tombs are filled with depictions of parties, games, and feasts. The idea was, eternity would be just one long banquet with your favourite hobbies on repeat. King Tut's tomb had chariots, board games, musical instruments, like a luxury afterlife starter pack, which means Tut was basically a guy buried with his Xbox and headphones, ready for an eternal LAN party. Festivals for the elite. Finally, we can't forget the big public festivals where pharaohs mingled with the masses. Yes, they were religious events, but for the royal court, they were also massive PR opportunities. Pharaohs appeared on golden barges during river processions, showered with petals, surrounded by music and cheers. It was spectacle. Imagine a royal parade where the pharaoh floats by, shining in gold while priests chant and crowds cheer. For the people, it was awe. For the pharaoh, it was, well, Tuesday entertainment. So what did the pharaoh and his court do for fun? They feasted until they regretted it, hunted animals already half tied down by servants, lounged in gardens that took entire teams to maintain, and made sure every game of Senet somehow symbolized the fate of the universe. But behind all the sacred symbolism and polished art, they were still just humans with too much time and too many resources, which means somewhere in the palace, a bored prince was probably sulking because he lost at Mehen while his pet monkey stole figs off the banquet table. And that, I think, is the most comforting part. Even at the top of the pyramid, literally, boredom still existed. So far we've peeked at peasants rolling dice, well, sticks, and pharaohs pretending their hippo hunt was a divine act of cosmic order. But of course, most Egyptians weren't lounging in palaces or having monkeys serve them wine. Most were just people, Farmers, builders, potters, weavers, scribes, people with sore backs, dusty clothes, and most importantly, spare time to kill. Because surprise, even in the ancient world, you couldn't just work all day every day. Sure, taxes and corvée labour loomed like storm clouds, but evenings were still evenings. And if you've ever wondered what fun looked like for the average Egyptian, well, it's part cosy, part mundane, and very human. The markets. Let's start with the market. Picture it. A dusty, open square lined with stalls, women selling bread, fishermen hawking the morning catch, someone shouting about onions like they're priceless gems. Markets were social hubs. You didn't just shop, you gossiped, bargained, and caught up on neighbourhood news. Buying onions may not sound thrilling, but in a world without TikTok, this was prime entertainment. You could stroll through, smell the spices, eye the pottery, listen to merchants yelling, and probably walk home with nothing you actually needed. Which makes the Egyptian marketplace not that different from today's farmers' markets. Except instead of organic kale signs, you had some guy yelling, "Dates! Fresh dates! Just harvested!" And yes, markets doubled as dating venues. Young men hanging around, young women pretending to inspect fish but really checking out who was in town. Basically, a socially acceptable excuse to flirt while buying leeks. Beer houses. Now, let's not sugarcoat it. Egyptians adored beer. It was a daily staple, but also a social lubricant. Beer houses, or tavern-like setups, were common. Archaeological finds and texts even suggest specific establishments, where people drank, ate, and occasionally caused trouble. These weren't glamorous. Think simple mud brick rooms, benches, clay mugs, a smoky atmosphere, and someone ladling thick, frothy beer from a big jar. And the vibe? Somewhere between a village pub and a gossip cafe. People played drinking games, they flirted, they argued, they fell asleep on benches. In fact, some surviving texts are essentially warnings. Don't linger at the beer hall or you'll disgrace yourself. Which means, of course, people did linger out the beer hall. A lot. It's oddly comforting that after 3,000 years, nothing has changed. Friday nights still end with questionable decisions and someone saying, "One more round." Workers at Deir el Medina. One of the best windows into everyday fun comes from Deir el Medina, the workers' village near the Valley of the Kings. These were the skilled labourers who built the royal tombs, and because they were literate, we actually have records of their lives. Turns out they had weekends off, 2 days every 10, dedicated to rest. What did they do? They played games, drank beer, sang songs, and hung out with their families. There are records of festivals, picnics by the Nile, and even strike action when they weren't paid on time. Yes, the world's first recorded labour strike happened in Egypt, and I'd bet my sandals it included some very sarcastic chanting. Kids in the village played with clay toys, animal figurines, spinning tops, little dolls. Adults joined in community festivals, and on quiet evenings, families gathered in their courtyards, told stories, shared bread, and probably complained about their foreman. Timeless workplace gripes. Music and dance for everyone. We've seen the polished party music of the court, but ordinary Egyptians had their own tunes. People played simple flutes, harps, and rattles. Children banged on drums or clapped rhythms. Music wasn't professional only, it was part of the home. And dancing, not just for trained performers, workers, farmers, women grinding grain, they all broke into rhythm sometimes. Scholars sometimes overanalyze Egyptian art as ritual movement, but I like to imagine it was just regular folks having a little dance-off when the mood struck. Picture two farmers after a long day of irrigation ditch duty. One pulls out a drum, the other starts stomping his sandals in the dust. Next thing you know, half the village is clapping along, not choreographed, just human fun. Festivals for the masses. Now, festivals weren't just elite spectacles. Ordinary people got days off to join in. Big processions meant free food, free beer, and a lot of communal joy. During the Festival of Upet, the entire city of Thebes partied. People lined the streets, cheered the gods' bark, and feasted on whatever scraps the temples handed out. It was part devotion, part carnival. And the Festival of Drunkenness? Ordinary people took it very seriously. Imagine thousands of villagers drinking themselves silly in honour of Hathor. Priests may have dressed it up as ritual ecstasy, but for the people, it was just sanctioned chaos. Festivals also featured games, tug-of-war, stick fights, mock boat races. Think of it like ancient fairground entertainment, except the prizes were less stuffed animal and more a good buzz and sore muscles. Domestic fun. Of course, a lot of entertainment happened at home. Families told stories, played games, or listened to travelling storytellers. Folk tales about talking animals, magical journeys, or gods who couldn't keep their tempers. Children played outside with balls of cloth or clay marbles. Girls played with dolls, some even jointed with string. Boys wrestled in the dust, showing off for each other. Parents probably sighed in exasperation because that hasn't changed in 3,000 years either. Even small tasks could turn into social fun. Baking bread became a group activity, with chatting and singing. Harvest season involved communal work, followed by communal feasts. There's evidence of people holding hands, laughing, joking in graffiti, scrawled on walls, which is the ancient version of carving "I was here" into a school desk. Storytelling as prime time. If Netflix was absent, stories filled the gap. Storytelling was a favourite evening entertainment. Professional storytellers roamed, but parents, grandparents and literate scribes all told tales. One popular folk tale was The Shipwrecked Sailor, which, a spoiler, has no action-packed climax. It's just a sailor meeting a giant talking snake who offers life advice. That's it. Which, let's be honest, is the perfect boy bedtime. Boring, gentle and mildly confusing. Stories also included gossip. People whispered it all about corrupt officials, scandalous nobles, or the neighbour who watered his fields on the wrong day. Human beings have always been nosy. Egyptians just didn't have tabloids, so they made do with whispers under the stars. Religion as entertainment. Finally, we can't ignore that religion doubled as spectacle. Even the average Egyptian saw temple rituals, sacred dramas and processions. For many that was their theatre. Priests in costumes reenacting myths, chants echoing through temple halls, incense filling the air. Sure, it was sacred, but for the common man, it was also a break from routine, something to watch, something to feel part of. Like ancient live theatre, with a side of divine insurance policy. So what did ordinary Egyptians do for fun? They gossiped at markets, drank at beer halls, danced with their neighbours, and laughed with their kids. They watched festivals, sang songs, told stories and rolled dice, or sticks, long into the night. And honestly, that sounds kind of nice. Quiet pleasures, shared moments, and a whole lot of communal laughter. Proof that even 3,000 years ago, life wasn't just about pyramids and gods. Sometimes it was about arguing over the price of onions and then stumbling home from the beer hall. So far, Egypt sounds cosy. Board games, beer halls, storytelling, a civilization that knew how to relax after irrigating fields all day. But of course, humans being humans, their fun also veered into the weird. The kind of activities that modern archaeologists politely call ceremonial, when really, you and I both know it was just another excuse to cut loose. So tonight, let's slide into that slightly stranger territory. Drunken rituals, bawdy humour and hobbies that make you wonder whether anyone in Thebes ever got bored enough to invent ancient stand-up comedy. The Festival of Drunkenness. We touched on it earlier, but it deserves its own slow-motion spotlight. Because the Egyptians didn't just drink at festivals, they had a festival entirely dedicated to drinking, and not moderate sipping, not polite toasts. The goal was intoxication. Here's the backstory. According to myth, the goddess Sekhmet once decided to wipe out humanity, very on brand for a lion-headed goddess. But Ra, the sun god, got nervous about losing all his worshippers, so he tricked Sekhmet by dyeing beer red to look like blood. She drank it all, got wasted and passed out. Humanity survived. So naturally, the Egyptians commemorated this by getting wasted themselves. Every year. The Festival of Drunkenness was held in Hathor's honour, and thousands gathered at her temple to drink until they collapsed. Priests framed it as spiritual ecstasy, but really it was a giant binge party with divine branding. Imagine the scene. A courtyard full of revellers, music blaring, people staggering around with clay mugs, someone loudly proclaiming eternal devotion while falling into a lotus pond. And the priest standing by, nodding like, yes, this is very holy. So the next time someone tells you binge drinking is a modern problem, just remind them it's actually a 3,000-year-old religious tradition. Erotic imagery and humour. Egyptians also had a playful, sometimes raunchy sense of humour. You won't hear that in school textbooks, but papyri and graffiti say otherwise. Take the Turin erotic papyrus, often called the world's first dirty comic strip. It shows acrobatic sexual scenes paired with jokes about priests and women. Scholars like to debate whether it was satire or ritual, but honestly it looks exactly like the sort of bawdy doodles bored workers would make to amuse themselves. Ancient equivalent of someone drawing questionable cartoons on a bathroom wall. And graffiti in Deir el-Medina, full of snark. Some were just names and dates, others were complaints about foremen or cheeky caricatures of gods. One worker literally drew a god with exaggerated genitals, which means ancient humour wasn't all that different from the doodles in your high school notebook. So yes, Egyptians found joy in jokes, satire and drawings that wouldn't exactly make it into the Louvre gift shop. Animals as entertainment. We know about pets, but animals also became part of fun in stranger ways. Exotic creatures were paraded in festivals, baboons were trained to dance, dogs to perform tricks, geese and ducks were herded in ponds for nobles to spear, more for the thrill than the meal. There's even evidence of monkey beer servers, which sounds hilarious until you realise the poor monkey probably spilled half the jug. Still, it entertained the guests, and gave scribes something to write home about. And crocodiles, kept in temple pools, occasionally pampered with jewellery. Which raises the question, was it entertainment, devotion, or just the ancient version of look at my cool pet? Probably all three. Sports with a side of pain. Egyptians enjoyed sport, but some of it looks less like fun and more like an ancient frat initiation. Stick fighting, for example. Two men armed with long sticks, whacking at each other until someone gave up. It was both training and recreation, and judging by tomb art, it could get pretty intense. Wrestling was another favourite, dusty, sweaty, often done in front of crowds. Children had gentler games like leapfrog, tug-of-war, or balancing contests. Adults, though, they leaned toward the let's see who can bruise the most style of recreation, which again, timeless. Somewhere right now, two guys are still whacking each other with sticks for fun. Fun with words. Not all Egyptian fun was physical. They loved wordplay. Scribes wrote satirical letters, parody poems, and sarcastic instructions. One famous piece, The Satire of the Trades, is essentially a scribe roasting every other job in the kingdom. Farmers, dirty and exhausted. Soldiers, always dying on campaign. Potter, burns himself constantly. The conclusion? Being a scribe is the only job worth having, which is pretty much the earliest recorded white-collar superiority complex. But it wasn't just smugness. Egyptians enjoyed puns, word games and riddles. Some papyri preserved tongue twisters and clever phrases, so if you've ever sat around making bad puns to pass the time, you're basically honouring a 4,000-year-old tradition. Leisure as laughter. All of this points to something historians sometimes forget. Egyptians laughed a lot. Tomb art may look solemn, but everyday graffiti and papyri show humour, sarcasm and wit. They joked about drunken priests, clumsy workers, and their own gods. They drew funny pictures. They teased each other. Because fun wasn't just about feasts and festivals, it was about finding humour in the ordinary. And in a world where the Nile flooded like clockwork and taxes never went away, Laughter may have been the cheapest entertainment of all. So when you picture Egyptian fun, don't just think of harps and lotus blossoms. Think of a courtyard full of people staggering at the Festival of Drunkenness, a worker doodling dirty cartoons on papyrus, or two men happily whacking each other with sticks while their friends cheer them on. It's messy, it's human, and, ironically, it makes Egypt feel less like a faraway empire and more like your own neighbourhood, just with better eyeliner. So not every Egyptian was out wrestling by the Nile or blacking out at the Festival of Drunkenness. A lot of fun was quieter, calmer, and honestly, more boring. The good kind of boring, the kind that makes perfect bedtime listening. Because at the end of the day, life in Egypt wasn't all pyramids and gods, it was weaving, carving, doodling, and fussing with jewellery. And for many Egyptians, fun came in the form of hands-on creativity. The kind that killed time, soothed the nerves, and maybe produced something useful. Weaving and textiles, weaving wasn't just work. For many, it was also a kind of hobby. Women, especially, spent hours weaving linen. And while yes, technically it was household duty, there's plenty of evidence that people took pride in it. Patterns, textures, even experimental dyes. Egyptian linen was famous, smooth, fine, and carefully made. And while the main purpose was clothing and shrouds, people also produced decorative cloth, sometimes purely for pleasure. So if you've ever sat with knitting needles or fiddled with embroidery, congratulations. You and some Egyptian woman from 1400 BC could have shared a quiet evening complaining about how the thread kept tangling. Carving and whittling. Then there's carving. Egyptians loved little figurines. Cats, hippos, ducks, people. Some were religious, others were just toyed or decorations. Workers whittled in spare time, shaping wood into animals or small trinkets. Not everything was destined for a tomb. Sometimes it was just a funny little hippo statue to sit on a shelf. There are even practice sculptures, awkward-looking little figures carved by apprentices, which means yes, ancient Egypt had its equivalent of failed high school pottery projects. Imagine someone proudly handing over a lopsided figurine like, "Look, father, I made a cat," and the father saying, "Yes, of course it's a cat." Jewellery as a hobby. Jewellery wasn't just luxury, it was pastime. Beads were everywhere, made of stone, shell, faience, that bright blue glazed ceramic. People strung them into necklaces, bracelets, anklets. Kids wore bead necklaces for protection. Women layered strings of bright blue and green. Men wore amulets carved with protective symbols. And in the process, stringing beads became a quiet activity. Imagine sitting with family, everyone threading little beads while gossiping about neighbours. Not loud, not fancy, just small talk, clinking beads, and the occasional dropped piece rolling away into the sand. Painting and doodling. Egyptian art wasn't all grand murals. Plenty of small doodles survive and sketches on pottery shards, scribbles on limestone flakes. These ostraca were essentially scrap paper, and people used them like sketch pads. Some are serious, practice hieroglyphs, portraits, mythological scenes. Others are silly. Animals walking upright, caricatures of officials, even little cartoons. So yes, somewhere in Deir el-Medina, a bored scribe drew a donkey dressed as a nobleman, and that was his idea of fun, which is basically the 3,000-year-old equivalent of drawing Shrek in your math notebook. Personal reading and writing. For the literate minority, and mostly scribes, reading and writing were entertainment. Papyrus wasn't cheap, but texts circulated. Stories, poems, instructional guides, even satire. Scribes copied tales like the story of Sinuhe or the tale of the doomed prince. These weren't thrilling action-adventure. They were slow, moralistic, sometimes meandering. Perfect bedtime literature. And letters themselves could be entertainment. Writing to friends, sending little notes, sometimes sarcastic ones. One letter basically says, "I lent you my cloak, when are you giving it back?" Another, "Stop ignoring me," which means ancient correspondence had the same passive-aggressive energy as modern text left unread. Gardens and quiet nature. We've talked about elite gardens, but even small households had courtyards. People planted herbs, flowers, maybe a tree if space allowed. Gardening could be meditative. Watering, tending, watching plants grow. It wasn't all about farming for survival. Sometimes it was about enjoying the lotus blossoms or smelling fresh herbs. Picture a tired worker sitting in a courtyard at dusk, sipping beer, staring at a few plants in the corner. Not glamorous, but peaceful. Relaxation by the Nile. And then, of course, there was the river itself. The Nile wasn't just a highway of trade, it was the main hangout spot. People sat by the banks, fished for fun, skipped stones, or just stared at the water. The annual flood made the land fertile, but it also provided rhythm to life. And when fields were too wet to work, people had downtime. They sat, they watched the current, they dreamed. The Nile was entertainment, therapy, and meditation rolled into one. So if you've ever sat by a lake or scrolled TikTok by a pool, that's basically what Egyptians did, minus the Wi-Fi. Little rituals that were really hobbies. Finally, we should note that a lot of Egyptian ritual was probably just fun, playing with incense, chanting, handling amulets. Sure, scribes called it sacred duty or taboo, but for the average person it was also cozy, soothing, and sometimes even playful. Lighting incense wasn't just devotions, it was relaxation. Offering food to household gods was also an excuse to nibble some bread. The line between religion and leisure blurred, so crafts, art, and quiet pastimes were just as much fun as festivals and parties. They gave Egyptians something to do in the evenings, besides collapse in bed. They painted little donkeys, strung beads into necklaces, fussed with gardens, and stared at the river. And somehow all that small mundane creativity feels more intimate than pyramids or temples, because behind every great civilization were people just keeping their hands busy and trying not to get bored. So far we've seen Egyptians play games, dance, drink themselves silly, and quietly whittle cats out of wood. But here's the thing, they didn't see fun as temporary. They genuinely believed it kept going after death. Which means that every banquet, every board game, every lazy Nile-side nap was a rehearsal for eternity. The afterlife wasn't an abstract, floaty heaven. For Egyptians, it was the field of reeds, basically paradise farmland. Imagine an eternal version of Egypt, but with perfect crops, perfect weather, and no tax collectors. That was their dream of forever. And naturally, they assumed all the fun stuff came along too. Packing for eternity. The tomb goods tell us everything we need to know. Pharaohs were buried with chariots, jewellery, instruments, game boards, even food. Ordinary people too tried to stash things in their graves. Bread, beer jars, amulets, figurines. King Tut's tomb is a prime example. Not just gold masks and thrones, but also toys, model boats, bows, musical instruments, and yes, multiple Senate boards. Because clearly Tut wanted to make sure that if the afterlife got boring, he'd have enough board games to rotate. It's basically the ancient equivalent of being buried with your Xbox, Kindle, and a year's supply of snacks. Eternal banquets. Art from tombs almost obsessively shows food. Loaves stacked high, geese roasted, wine poured into jars. Why? Because eternity, in their minds, was one long dinner party. And not just endless feasting, endless perfect feasting. No indigestion, no hangovers, no complaints about the beer being too thick. Just eternal all-you-can-eat buffets under lotus trees. Servants, or rather, little magical figurines called a shabti, were buried to do the hard work. They'd magically animate in the afterlife to plough fields, bake bread and pour drinks. Which means the Egyptian version of paradise was sit back, relax, play Senate, eat goose, and let your little servant dolls do the chores. Honestly, not a bad retirement plan. Games without end. Remember Senate? The afterlife turned it into a cosmic marathon. Every piece moving across the board symbolized the soul's journey through trials and toward rebirth. Which means, in theory, you'd be playing forever. Archaeologists like to spin this as deeply spiritual. But let's be honest, it also sounds like a lot of downtime filled with dice rolls. The gods probably got tired of humans bugging them, so they were like, "Here, play Senet until eternity ends." It's worth noting too, tombs sometimes show musicians and dancers performing forever in paradise, which means Egyptians imagined an endless concert, a celestial Spotify playlist of harps and flutes never running out of battery. Sports in the afterlife. Not to be left out, nobles imagined hunting and fishing in paradise, Tumat shows, serene scenes of men throwing nets in crystal clear waters or spearing gazelles in perfect marshes. Was it practical? Not really, but it symbolised leisure, mastery over nature, and frankly the joy of showing off. Because what's the point of eternal paradise if you can't brag about catching the world's biggest afterlife catfish? Love and family. Forever fun wasn't just solitary. Tomb inscriptions often show couples together, it says. Holding hands, sitting side by side, sharing food. Family life was eternal too. Egyptians didn't picture a lonely afterlife. They pictured one filled with their spouses, kids, and friends. Of course, this raises the awkward question. What if you didn't like your spouse? Too bad. The art still shows you smiling together for eternity. So in a way, Egyptian paradise was eternal family dinners you couldn't skip. Eternal music and perfume. Let's not forget sensory pleasures. Music, perfume, flowers. The afterlife had pools filled with lotus blossoms, singers strumming harps, dancers moving in slow rhythm. Incense curled through the air. Oils perfumed the skin. And because it was eternal, none of it got old. The same harp tune played for the millionth time, still divine. The same lotus perfume, still fresh. Which means Egyptians imagined forever as basically a spa weekend, endlessly looping. Death as a continuation and a fun. All of this reflects the Egyptian attitude. Death wasn't an end, it was a continuation. If you loved board games, you'd get more board games. If you loved feasts, you'd get endless feasts. If you loved staring at the Nile, well, the field of reeds had a bigger, shinier Nile just for you, which makes Egyptian fun strangely comforting. They didn't see joy as fleeting. They saw it as something so important, it deserved to last forever. In the end, Egyptian fun wasn't just about passing time in this life, it was rehearsal for eternity. Feasts, games, songs and naps under lotus trees. An eternal weekend with no Monday looming. And maybe that's why they painted it on their tombs with such care. They weren't just remembering fun, they were booking it in advance.